All right.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me here. I am really excited to share the work that I do as a behavioral designer. And at Lirio, I have the privilege of working alongside all of these fabulous AI scientists and really bringing behavioral design to life in concert with AI. There aren't many places I'm aware of where you're able to do that. So it's been a really wonderful journey for me, and I'm happy to be here tonight. So I'm really just gonna step you through the process of what behavioral design is and how we bring it to life in digital interventions. I'm assuming that most of the people who are part of this event don't have a deep experience with behavioral design. So hopefully this isn't too back to basics. But I think I can also illustrate some of the points that Dr. Rose talked about and hopefully help you all understand a little bit the type of work that we do in behavioral design and why it is such a wonderful advantage to be able to work with artificial intelligence in bringing behavioral design to life. So to start with what behavioral designers do, if I had to give you kind of a dictionary definition of it, it would be this: we facilitate the ability of people to work toward goals. And I have goals in bold font because one of the things that's very important here, and this builds on a point that Dr. Rose made, the goals belong to the person that we are trying to assist, whose behavior we're trying to shape or change. It's a core tenet of behavioral design that we are not trying to force people to do something that they are not interested in doing. We're not trying to coerce them in any way. It is really ideally a goal that is really in concert with what they value for themselves. And in fact, one of the things that we often try to do with behavioral design is to help people make choices for themselves about what their goals are in a way that aligns with their values, aligns with their identities, aligns with other sorts of life goals they may have. So I always bold the word goals when I talk about behavioral design, because that is such an important point. And there often is a conception that behavioral science is almost like a magic trick that you can do to people to get them to behave in ways that they may not be aware of. That is outside of our ethical considerations. We do not want to trick people. So we're facilitating their ability to work toward their own goals by designing interventions. That's bolded basically because it's jargon. Anything that we develop, we call an intervention, that address barriers to target behaviors and promote conditions that are favorable to target behaviors. So really, we are trying to shape anything we can about the environment, about people's attitudes, their beliefs, their knowledge, their tools that help them to do these behaviors that are aligned with their goals. I mentioned that intervention is our jargon. It's our term for anything that we design that is intended to change people's behavior, to get them to act differently than they would have in the absence of that intervention. And it can really be anything. It could be a product, an experience, a communication. These are some examples of interventions. So you may be familiar with some of them. Nagbot, Wobot, and Headspace are both in the behavioral health space. They really work with mood and meditation. Stash is one in the investment space. And this last example is a communication that we build at Lirio. So just to give an example of what we do in our work. I also wanted to point out two of the tools that we use in designing interventions, and I will talk about both of these as I go, but you will hear the term nudges, and Dr. Rose defined this earlier, but this is a different but concurrent definition. Nudges are features in the choice architecture that make it more likely that somebody does one thing than another. And then behavior change techniques is a broader category that includes nudges, but these are theory-based methods for changing one or more determinants of a person's behavior. And I have the photo of the highway interchange in the background deliberately, because when I talk about nudges in comparison to some other behavior change techniques, I think of nudges very much like the signs on a highway that might direct a person to get on or off at a particular exit. They occur in the environment at a point in time when a person is capable to act on them. There are other behavior change techniques that are a little bit more less in the moment. So for example, there are behavior change techniques that work on motivation. And I think these are very important to consider in designing an intervention, because if you think about something like somebody's health, we know that there are these moments of decision that are really critical. So things like making a doctor's appointment is a really important episodic behavior that people need to do regularly, whether it's once a year or more often than that. a nudge is really a great tool to get people to take action if they're in a place, in a context where they can do that. You can build a nudge into the choice architecture that leads somebody to pick up the phone and make that call and make that appointment. But there are all kinds of health behaviors that take place every day. Hundreds and hundreds of small decisions that people make that add up to their overall health. And it would be impossible for us to really architect their experience so that there's a nudge at every single one of those decision points. And that's why it's really important for us to understand that broader context, people's motivation, and how we can help them to essentially build their own nudges. How can they bring this behavior, these choices forward into their daily lives when it does not make sense, it's impractical or impossible for us to design it for them. So we follow a standard process in behavioral design. I think is very similar to the scientific method. One thing I do want to point out when we're doing behavioral design, is we're really thinking about engaging people on two different levels. And this is particularly true in the digital space. There's a quote from a former United States Surgeon General that I sometimes use, Dr. C. Everett Koop, where he says, medications only work in people who take them. And similarly, interventions only work in people who interact with them. And so we think about engagement and effectiveness in two ways. And this is from an article that was written by some of my former colleagues at Johnson & Johnson. So this is very aligned with the way that I think about behavioral design. There's big E and little e. And both of them are really important. So little e is engagement with the digital intervention, with the digital experience. This is why it's the design piece is very important. And that is a broad umbrella when I say design here. It's really important that we are building tools, interventions that are engaging, interesting, well-designed. We're competing with all kinds of consumer technologies for people's time and attention. And so it is important to think about things that make our interventions interesting for people. If you've ever worked in a design field, you've probably heard the term, people will say, oh, delightful. It's kind of a joke that, we make delightful designs, but it is important because if people don't use an intervention, it will not change their behavior. And then the biggie is really about engaging with the behavior change, doing something differently in the real world as a result of that intervention. And we really need both. You can think of it like, a math problem. If you don't have both pieces, you won't get the result you want. And so we really are trying to pay attention both to the behavioral determinants, the kind of real world context for those health behaviors, but then from a perspective, how do we build something that is really interesting, that works with a person's life? Our process essentially, and you'll see all kinds of different labels on this, but in every place that I've ever worked and my colleagues in behavioral design, we all use variations on the same process. And it really begins with research. So understanding the problem space in as much depth as we can. This includes literature review, but it also includes conducting our own primary research, including ideally with patients, as Dr. Rose pointed out. Once we have gained that understanding of the problem space, we want to design. This is where we're generating our hypotheses. We're creating early prototypes, use cases, requirements, putting some definition around what the intervention might be. And again, we're hopefully getting this in front of people, getting feedback, understanding if it is something that fits their life so that we can achieve that little e engagement. Once we've reached a place of confidence that this intervention is what we need it to be, we'll actually work to build it. And I've found in my experience as a behavioral designer, this often means collaborating closely with other folks who bring it to life. So whether it's our AI scientists who are, understanding what data to use and what kind of output to produce, or visual designers who are actually creating screens, interaction designers who are developing how a digital experience unfolds for a person. My job at this point is really to communicate to them what the behavioral science is behind the requirements and work closely with them to make sure that what they produce is true to those requirements, that there's fidelity in the way that the behavior science comes to life. And then once we have an intervention and we put it out into the world, we want to test. So we want to be measuring both that little e and that big E engagement, gathering product feedback, maintaining our improvement backlog, monitoring our data, and ideally iterating over time. So, an important part of the mindset as well is that these digital interventions shouldn't be a static product that goes into the world and remains as is. We have the opportunity to continually iterate and improve. A tool that I use often in my work is what I call an outcomes logic map, but this also illustrates a truth about behavioral design, which is that we start with the end in mind. The first thing we do is we define the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve, and then we work backwards from there to understand, in order to achieve these outcomes, what do people need to do differently? What do we need to help them do or order for them to do that differently? What supports do they need? And then even before that, what is the current state? We want to measure a baseline so that we can monitor progress over time and understand if we're really making a difference. This is an overly simplified example. It actually comes from my book. So it's created for illustrative purposes, but it does show a little bit what one of these might look like built out. So again, starting with the long-term outcomes, and what you see in the white space here is where we might measure that, because it's not always realistic for us to do all of the measurement from our intervention itself. So many interventions do collect data. An example might be, you know how many people have created an account. If you have an app, how many people have downloaded it, you may be able to tell where they've clicked. But there are other things where we need to work with third-party data sources in order to understand what we're dealing with. And so I tried to provide examples of what that might look like. So in terms of long-term outcomes, in the healthcare space, we really just see variations on the same few themes. So people want a return on investment. They want to reduce healthcare expenditures. They want to redirect healthcare expenditures to more planned, deliberate places. So, not emergency rooms, but rather going to and using preventative services. They want to see reduced incident of serious health conditions. So that might be a reduction in blood pressure. It might be fewer cancer diagnoses or cancer diagnoses happening at an earlier stage. And fewer of these critical health events like heart attacks or strokes. And we can typically get that data from things, if we're working with a healthcare organization, they usually will have some kind of data on their own population that helps us to understand what the baseline and the future frequency of those are. In terms of behavior changes, here, this example was set up in terms of reducing people's blood pressure. So common behavior change problem in healthcare. And some of the behavior changes we might be looking at if we want to achieve that result of reducing people's blood pressure and then ultimately doing things like saving money because people are not having heart attacks and strokes at the same rate. We want to make sure that they're doing things like making their doctor's appointments, taking the medications that are prescribed to them, getting regular exercise. And typically these sorts of behaviors, if you think again about a typical digital experience, we would not necessarily be able to measure all of these directly. And so we might choose to do something like survey our users on a quarterly basis. Participation and engagement, this is really how are people using that intervention? And this is that category I mentioned where you can typically get this sort of data from your intervention itself. So this is really your usage metrics. And these are, again, very important because if people don't use the intervention, it does not lead to results. And then lastly, baseline measurements, that's the state today. So just so you can measure that delta. As you can probably tell from the high blood pressure example there, typically there's a long list of what we call target behaviors, the things that we're trying to get people to do differently that we might consider building for, that we might consider designing around. And typically we don't want to design for the universe. We want to selectively choose some behaviors that really will make the biggest impact and create a really effective intervention. So we go through a ratings process of our candidate target behaviors to determine which ones we actually want to design for. And this is a mix of scientific and practical evaluation. So on the scientific side, we are trying to figure out which behaviors are actually going to create those outcomes. This is where we might rely really heavily on a literature review, on expert consensus, really trying to understand from existing data and existing perspectives where we might see the biggest movement if we intervene in people's behaviors. From a practical perspective, we want to consider things like, do we actually have access to the people who do these behaviors? In healthcare, sometimes it might be a physician behavior that is really influencing outcomes, but we are working with an organization that really just talks to patients. And so in that case, we wouldn't want to consider that behavior. Can you influence them within the constraints of your toolkit? One of the things that we do at Lirio is we prompt people to make recommended physician appointments at a particular time. And we reach them with, text messaging, with emails. And so that really puts some brackets around the way that we communicate with them and the way that we think about that behavior. What is the effort and cost of influencing those behaviors relative to their effect? We typically don't want to spend a lot of time designing for something that's extremely difficult to change and perhaps doesn't have a very large impact on the results. And then working with artificial intelligence, one of the things that we have to be very mindful of in behavioral design that's a little bit different from some other spaces is in order to enable the reinforcement learning, we really need to have that data back on the behavior. So we are specifically trying to select target behaviors where we know we will have access to the behavioral data, where we'll know if people took action or not. In defining the target behaviors, it's really important for us to be specific and measurable. So just if you understand data, which obviously all of you do, you understand why this is so important. And so we would be trying to say something like, scheduling a mammogram when eligible, and not something like get healthier or follow recommendations, because those two things are just simply not really measurable. And they are also not good design targets, because then we have to figure out what that means. Just to give an example, at Lirio, we recently built and launched a program to get people to have their colonoscopies when they're eligible. And these are the target behaviors that we selected to design for. So they are scheduling the colonoscopy. There's some steps that you need to complete before you can go for the colonoscopy. So you have to arrange transportation to and from the procedure. You have to obtain prep materials, and then you actually have to complete that preparation in the day or so before the appointment. And then, of course, you have to attend the appointment. And so in doing our research, these were the really critical behaviors to get somebody to that other side where they have met the recommendation of completing their colonoscopy. One thing to point out in terms of our toolkit when we get into design is that not all of these behaviors are equal. So there's some behaviors that are relatively easy to change. So things like clicking on a link. It's a fairly straightforward behavioral design toolkit to get somebody to do something like that. We know a lot about how to get people to do that. But then some of the behaviors that we're trying to design for are very complex. And what we start to see is that there are multiple behaviors that get bundled together into an experience for somebody. And so one example here is managing a chronic health condition. And oftentimes people who have a serious health condition have comorbidities, other health conditions as well. And they may need to consider medication, diet, exercise, other healthcare where they're going in and seeing specialists. And we really have to think about all of those things in tandem and how to prioritize them. An example that I added in the last year for obvious reasons is everything related to COVID management and mitigation. It's a very complex set of behaviors that work together. And again, this is an area where there's a lot of utility in partnering with artificial intelligence, because it can help us make some of those decisions about priority order and how behaviors fit together based on data, as opposed to based on our expert judgment. And there's really some advantage to being able to think through these complex patterns using that technology. In terms of understanding target behaviors, I've used this term barriers. That's basically anything that makes the target behavior hard. Once we've identified the target behaviors, we want to do research to really understand those barriers, because what our design is going to do is either help people avoid those barriers or help them overcome those barriers. So we've got to know what they are. And this again ties into Dr. Rosa's talk a bit. So the work that we do to understand those barriers to target behaviors, this is a combination of primary and secondary research. In terms of our primary research, we work very closely with our client organizations, which are usually healthcare providers, systems. And we do things like talk to stakeholders, talk to people who work in that system about their understanding of the patient experience. We look at all of the artifacts. What are the educational materials they're giving patients? What are the call scripts that they're using when they call people and ask them to make the appointment? We actually listen to recordings of patient calls when we can, so that we can hear firsthand what that experience is like for them. If they are using technology in the experience, we want to audit that. We want to create a demo account and actually use it ourselves. We want to get patient feedback. We want to talk to patients before we even start to build the intervention, to understand from their perspective what that experience is like. And that research might include things like observing them. It could include interviewing them. It can include something called participatory design, where we actually start to get them to do some creative activities so that we can understand their experience in a little more depth. And that's particularly helpful if there's a strong emotional component to the behavior, because it can be very difficult for people to reflect on that and talk about it. So it's a way to get that information out without directly querying. This is an example of what it looks like when we go through this process. So we've been using Neural lately to organize our materials, but really anything that allows us to start to cluster things in themes, annotate, and really link it back to the literature. So there's typically, for any health behavior, robust literature in behavioral science that shows what has been difficult in the past. And the more that we can link what we're discovering in our primary research to what's already been done, it gives us a language and some roots to work from. And this is just another example where we start to map that then to what we call the action path. So if somebody is going to do something like schedule a colonoscopy, what are all of the steps that go into that? How do these barriers fit? We're really trying to assemble something that's a little bit more like a journey map, so that we can really, really understand how we're designing to improve this experience. Mention literature review. We always do a literature review. We do not want to start fresh when there is an existing body of peer-reviewed evidence out there. So just an example, what we're looking for, what are the behavioral determinants for this behavior? So what are the barriers? What are the facilitators? What are some of the factors about individuals that influence how they experience those barriers? So one of the things that we see quite frequently, I know in the US, and I assume there's some version of this in other parts of the world as well, but what we call social determinants of health, things like your zip code. If you don't live close to a fresh food source, you may experience barriers around certain behaviors. If you don't live close to healthcare, if there's no reliable transportation, those sorts of things. What do we know about people that helps us understand what their barriers might be? And then what has worked in the past? What other types of interventions have been successful around this behavior? When we uncover the barriers, we organize them according to behavior science frameworks. One that we use a lot is the COM-B model. It comes from the University College of London. It's about a decade old now, and it actually started as a taxonomy, a review of the literature around behavior change and trying to understand, can we group barriers reliably into certain categories? And what they found is, yes, you can. These three categories, the C, the O, the M. So B is behavior. C is capability. It's either your psychological or your physical ability to do the behavior. The O is opportunity. This is the environment that you're in, and that can be either the physical built environment or the social environment, the other people around you who might enable a behavior or make it more difficult. And then M is motivation, and reflective motivation is very much the way we use the term in our normal conversation. It's, my goals and my goal priority, and it's something that people are able to reflect and talk about. Automatic motivation is more about the mental models that people have around what is appropriate behavior, what is effective behavior. And these are often not something people are aware of because they develop over time. They develop from the culture you were raised in. And many people are not introspective about those things. And even if you try to be, it's like asking a fish to tell you about water. So I personally find that piece very, very interesting to research because it is just a little bit more mysterious. When we organize those barriers into these categories, it's very helpful to us for a few reasons. So one of them is simply economy, creating some streamlining in our design. So here again, with our colonoscopy project, we found 24 unique barriers in all of our research, but using that COM-B model, we're able to consolidate them to 11 constructs. And so that gives us a little bit of a cleaner design, a little bit, something more streamlined to work with. And even then, we are going to go through and prioritize our barriers similar to how we prioritized our behaviors so that we're really designing for the most critical barriers, the ones that are affecting the most people, the most severely, the most often. And we do this, we numerically rank them based on the evidence that we have, and they have to meet a certain threshold to be included in our design. When we think about our design, this is, the behavior is the place we want to get the person to. And there are however many barriers that exist in between the person and the behavior. For each one of them, we want to offer a behavior change technique. So if you recall, that's one of those evidence-based techniques that seeks to somehow change a person's behavior. The behavior change techniques can also be grouped into categories, which are called intervention functions. There are 10 of them. This is them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Most of them should be pretty familiar to people just from your experience as humans. So, education, persuasion, incentives. Enablement is one that is less familiar to people. It's really any sort of additional support. So if you think about something like medication, nicotine replacement therapy for cigarettes, that would be an example of enablement where it really kind of goes above and beyond most of these intervention functions. But again, from that work with COM-B and the taxonomy, they found that for the most part, interventions to change people's behavior can be grouped into one of these 10 categories. And here I mentioned the COM-B model having utility for design. And here's the second reason why, because it can actually connect those barrier types to the intervention functions. This is based in research. And it basically says that more often than not, when we see this type of barrier, these are the types of intervention functions that tend to be effective at resolving it. And so when we're doing our design, we've gotten to the point now where we've prioritized those barriers. We know to look to these categories for designing the features of our intervention. There's yet more to the taxonomy. I'm not going to go into this because there are 97 items on here. These are the actual behavior change techniques. So even below the intervention functions, what are the specific features that you might offer that change people's behaviors? I have to be honest, I primarily use this as a brainstorming tool. But as an example, there's feedback and monitoring. So monitoring the behavior and telling people how it's going. There's verbal persuasion about capability. So you can do it, and you can see how that might influence motivation. So it's a useful tool. And one of the other things that's really great about this tool, this is online, it's called the theory and technique tool. And it actually shows where there's a stronger evidence base connecting certain mechanisms of action. So, ways of changing behavior to these specific behavior change techniques. And we use this often as well. And what we like to do, of course, we're trying to select things with stronger evidence, but it also allows us to selectively choose places where we want to test or generate our own evidence. So that's kind of an exciting way to think about our work too. We don't always just want to do what has been proven to work, but we also want to be learning and advancing the science ourselves. So a tool like this allows us to start to understand where some of those gaps may exist for us to address. We actually build all of this into a tool that we call our strategy matrix. So this is kind of a consolidated, simplified version of it, but we're basically saying, okay, these are the barriers we've observed. These are the intervention functions that align with them. These are the behavior change techniques we're choosing to bring to life for each of these intervention functions. And then we create our messaging content, which is both images and words. And we do what we call a manipulation check, where we have folks who weren't involved in the creation of that content go through and rate it. And we calculate basically a statistic to show that there was enough agreement. And that gives us confidence that we successfully brought those behavior change techniques to life. Just really quickly, once we have either a prototype or a live intervention, we do also want to test it and make sure it works. And again, we're looking for the big E and the little e. These are two different E's though, effectiveness and efficacy. And we're testing for both of these things too. So efficacy is whether or not the intervention works in a controlled environment. And if you see a behavioral scientist talking about a randomized control trial, an RCT, this is what they're testing, where they have really strictly managed all of the variables, and they're comparing a group of people who are using the intervention with a group of people who are not, trying to keep as much else constant across the two groups so that they can confidently say that any differences in behavior is due to the intervention. RCTs are the gold standard. They are also very complex to run. They're expensive, they're time consuming, they're not always practical. So you want to do some RCTs, but you also want to make sure that you're doing other kinds of testing as well, where you can get a quicker read on whether or not something works and a fuller picture of how it works. So effectiveness is really about, does the intervention work in the real world? And we ideally want to be testing both of these. To think about all the ways behavioral scientists, behavioral designers test the intervention, these are roughly ordered from how efficacy focused they are. So that, sort of ideal situation, controlling for extraneous variables, down to effectiveness focused, really real world focus with all the messiness and noise that introduces. And so you see RCTs are again, the gold standard of efficacy focus, but we can also do things like quasi-experimental studies where, we have one location of a healthcare system with an intervention live and another location doesn't have it live. And there's a lot of similarities between those two groups. It's not controlled the way an RCT is, but we can still draw some pretty good conclusions, all the way down to at the bottom with effectiveness focused, usability studies are really about, does the person understand how to accomplish a task within the digital environment? Just really quickly, two last things I wanted to highlight. One is, how much does a BCT change behavior? This is effect sizes are from the literature. These are not primary data, but in general, we find that any behavior change technique does not have a huge impact on people's behavior. And this is data that's gathered across groups. So in this data, basically, a behavior change technique was offered to a homogeneous or heterogeneous group of people. And on average, it had a small or a medium effect. The definition for this, Cohen, who created Cohen's D, one of the inferential statistics that you use to measure effect size, he said that a medium effect size is something that a careful observer might actually notice. So it's not a huge effect. It's not like every single person is affected by this. I just wanted to show this because to me, this is part of what's really exciting about working with AI, because what we can do is we can start to match people more effectively to the right behavior change technique. And again, this is data across a group of people. There are people within that group for given behavior change technique is very powerful. And the more that we can start to optimize that matching, the more successful our interventions will be on the whole. So for me, that is an extremely exciting part of the marriage between AI and behavioral design. And then just another piece I wanted to point out, a thing that we can and should be doing is monitoring our own results. So as we are doing this matching and trying to see which behavior change techniques work for which people, we can also be making some decisions, some inference about which behavior change techniques perhaps don't work much at all. Some of these may have so little of an effect that it is not worth the while to include them in the design anymore, where others may be so powerful that it is worth ensuring that they are always included, or that there's more than one version of it included. And so, this is something that my team is working on doing more, and that we're, again, really excited about, because if we can make the basic ingredients of the intervention as powerful as possible and then apply AI to the delivery of them, I think we really have something unstoppable. So I will stop there. That's my email address. Please feel free to reach out, but see if there's any questions.
Thanks so much, Amy. Really appreciate you joining us as well and giving this talk. I have a question, but I'll wait and see if somebody else. Well, I'll jump in. So when you look at this and you're doing your design, there's, obviously we've talked about this before, but when it comes to certain interventions, there are communications. Mm-hmm. That seems a little easier. Is there a big piece of digital intervention design that is not about language or that type of communication?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about something even like, I use a Garmin, but like I think Apple Watch is probably even a better example of this, where it gives you that haptic feedback over the course of the day. And that is, of course, a type of communication, but it's not a language type of communication. So it's measuring your activity levels, and then it's showing you a visualization of how much movement, what type of movement, and it's actually prompting you to get more of it. So those sorts of real world monitoring are probably, the top thing that comes to mind for me. There's also things that, so like, for example, there's a lot of evidence that just measuring something can lead people to change the behavior. So if you give people a step counter, their steps go up. I want to say it's like 17% just by nature of having the counter, because now they're paying attention and they're making some effort, even in the absence of you asking them to do that. Similarly, if you ask people to do a food diary, they typically will drop their calorie consumption a little bit right away, because they're picking up on things themselves. Having those numbers in front of them makes their behavior real. And so there's things like that you can do where it's kind of the feature that is prompting the change in behavior, as opposed to what you're saying about it or any kind of communication wrapped within it.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, yeah, that was a really great talk, really interesting. I was just curious to know, because I kind of was in psychology very, very briefly before I got dragged into statistics and then AI. But I'm just curious to know how you kind of manage the friction between kind of coming up with and defining all these kind of very latent concepts and, that are borrowed from psychology. Right, so you've got this framework for understanding and designing the kind of interventions you want to deploy. How do you manage the friction between all of that and actually the practical feature engineering that comes in when you decide to, construct a specific set of models to decide on to implement these interventions essentially.
Yeah, so that is a real friction that I think has affected every single project I've ever worked on, and I personally really enjoy that challenge. I think of it as a fun puzzle to try to understand just the practical limitations, and that can be the technology. What will the technology actually support? I mentioned, one of the things with AI, we need the data, the behavioral data back, and that is a different behavior change problem than others I've worked on, where we can prompt people to do something, I don't know, meditate 5 minutes a day, and how would you necessarily know for sure that people do that? It could be something around the business context as well, and we deal with that quite a bit. I mean, all right, one thing that I'll bring up that constant in the United States, we have HIPAA. It's a privacy law, and one of the things that follows from HIPAA is that when you email somebody about a health related thing, a service, you cannot say in that email, hey, Matthew, you have diabetes and we have all this great stuff for your diabetes. That would be potentially exposing their health data to a third party without their consent. And so I think of it as sort of a fun puzzle. How do we construct this communication in a way that piques the person's interest, connects them to those resources, but also observes the correct privacy rules? However, it also leads to some of the limitations that Dr. Rose talked about. I think some of what she talked about in terms of ethics, some of these missteps, and maybe that's a little bit strong. It doesn't always necessarily have to result in something that is borderline unethical, but we certainly don't always achieve the efficacy that we could because we are making some of these trade-offs. And that's the hard part of it. When in an ideal world, on paper, I have mapped out this beautiful intervention that would be so much better. But in the real world, we've had to make these concessions for practical reasons. And I would say those more often come from kind of the legislative or the customer side rather than the technology side. I've found in my experience working in commercial organizations with technology teams that we're all like it's a bunch of nerds together who are excited to collaborate on solving a problem. So I haven't typically found it's coming from that side. It's more, what's permitted by the client organization.